Thank you, welcome. Can you hear me up the back okay? Great. Lovely to see you all. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy week to join with me this evening. Just wanted to ask who here is looking for some tips to thrive straight up? Why have you come? Yep. Okay, well that's a good start because I'm at least on topic to start with. I have been told that I'm not allowed out of this boundary and out of this boundary, so if I go too far either way, pull me back, please. In the time I have with you this evening, there's a few things I'd like to cover. My goal tonight is really to give you an overview of some of the work that we're doing, that I'm doing, that we're doing at the centre, and also for those of you newer to wellbeing science and the science of positive psychology, give you some of the broad background and basics there, but also stretch it out to show you where we're going. So firstly, we will explore what is this thing called thriving, which is one of the reasons we're here, and of course is part of Psychology Week, which we now know there's up to 7,000 people who have been on to do the online PERMA survey, which you may have done, and growing. So we'll start with that. Then I want to talk with us all about this idea of negativity bias. What is that and how pervasive is that and where does that fit in the area of positive psychology, the science of positive psychology? Some of you will be very familiar with that, but even if you're familiar with it, I want to extend it a bit further to explore why that's so important to our work. Then we're going to talk about white wine. Particularly, it should be red wine, but I want to talk about approach motivation and avoidance motivation. You may have heard of that, may be familiar with it, but again, I'm going to explore that and show you the applications of that particular area. Then we'll come and look at individual-based thriving and some of the models that you are familiar with, but I'm going to apply them and get you to work with them, and I will get you to do some work. Who's familiar with that particular? Anybody been there? Okay, that's the inside of the new cancer centre. So I'm going to give you some applications. Firstly, some of this in applications in the health sector, in health systems and mental health sector. Some brief comments about applications at work. Obviously, we don't have time to do this in depth, but I'm going to highlight particular areas. And as we've heard, Centre for Positive Psychology is in the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. So I will talk about briefly some of the applications in the education sector. I'll introduce you to work that I'm currently looking at called Wellbeing literacy, which complements the existing mental health literacy, but more in a positive and a wellbeing frame. And then we'll end with tying that up with your handout. So you go away with some ideas and applications, bringing this together for your particular personal life or your workplace. So there's quite a bit to do, but we will land this plane just after 7 p.m. and go on our way. So straight to the point of what I really want to get you to think about right now is what is this thing called thriving? One of the things I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to introduce some brand new material. There will be a book that comes out of this particular presentation, but I'm going to work with you and show you the scaffolding of effectively what is a new model of wellbeing that I've been working on for a while and will continue to work on. So this is the first public forum where this has been presented. So you should all have a handout on the way you got in, and there should be a little box. What is thriving? From your perspective, just write it down. So just on your sheet, just write down what is thriving. Just a definition. Try and make it a sentence with full stop. commas, those sorts of things. Try and keep it in the box as well. Okay, they tell me psychologists are very serious folks and they won't do things, but once you've finished, if you could just put your hands on your heads, then I'll know who's done. They tell me psychologists are too serious to do this. Nurses and teachers do it. So just so I can get a sense of who's good. Okay, we've got that on video now, so. All right, you can, as you were. One of the things, if we're developing a science, the science of wellbeing, in this case, the science of thriving, if we're dealing with the construct of thriving, one of the important things, of course, with science is we've got to define our terms. So that then we can then measure them. So let's have a look at the definition you just came up with. Firstly, I'll ask you the question, looking at your definition, what level did you come in? In research we'll call it level of analysis. What level did you come in at? Did you, when you were defining thriving, did you assume that you were at the individual level? Or were you thinking more at the group, family, team, organisation, or whole of society? So that's one thing just to think about. When I'm truly thinking about thriving, what am I actually assuming? So who here was probably more assuming coming in at defining at the individual level? There's no right or wrong here. Okay, it's exactly what I'd expect, not just in Australian culture, but also in probably a group of people trained in psychology. Nothing wrong with that. It's just it's important to be more explicit about what level we are coming in at. So that's one way of dealing with what we're talking about. Secondly, many of you are familiar with wellbeing science. You would have heard of the well-worn distinction between hedonic and eudaimonic wellbeing. If you haven't, hedonic, coming from the philosophy of Bentham, the idea of pleasure, satisfaction, red wine, good times, having a good time, getting our needs met, that sort of idea. That's happiness. That's one view. Different view, more from an Aristotelian philosophy, eudaimonic wellbeing, as it gets referred to, true self, meaning, purpose, virtues, personal growth, development, a different way of thinking about wellbeing. So I didn't ask you to define wellbeing, but similar things are working here. Whose definition of thriving was more in line with pleasure, happiness, positive emotions? It doesn't have to be either or, it's sometimes. Okay, who was more in the meaning, growth, purpose? You're a very sophisticated lot, aren't you? Okay, so that's one thing to think about in the way we approach these definitions. Very important, because if you're going to measure outcomes, what are you actually measuring? If we're saying we're happy or thriving, what is it? What are the assumptions? Thirdly, did you actually define thriving? Give a list of examples of things that people do to thrive. Who gave lists of examples? Okay, and so who gave a standalone definition or maybe some examples? Okay, one of the things you'll see when you ask people to do these sorts of things is they'll often give examples, or they'll give examples from their personal life. And that's all okay. One of the big challenges of wellbeing science is what is the outcome, what's the predictor, what's the antecedent, what's the mechanism? So what's chicken, what's egg, and that's part of the bigger debate. If I'm thriving, do I perform better? If I'm performing well, do I thrive? These are some of the big challenges in getting our heads around this area. Who had a definition that has multiple parts? Like I tried to get you into one sentence, but who found that they had to have commas and start adding things? Yeah. So it's well accepted that well-being, thriving is really a multi-dimensional construct, or something with multiple bits, multiple parts. And that's a challenge again when you come to measure it. You're psychologists, many of you, so you'll remember the debates with intelligence, and is there a G factor, a single intelligence, or are there multiple bits? Same thing, I wonder whether there's a W factor or a T factor. Is thriving all one thing, or is there bits? At the moment, people generally think there are multiple bits to it. And finally, did your definition involve the presence of something positive, or the absence of something negative, or both? Who had a definition that involved the presence of something positive? Okay, and that's probably what we'd expect from this audience. One of the contemporary view of wellbeing science is we're really talking about there's something good there. It's not just that something bad is removed, and that will make a lot more sense as we work through. Okay, don't do it now. You may wish to revise your definition. You may be very happy with it, but that's what you've got tonight, and that's what we'll keep working with. Are we ready to keep going? Yep. Okay. This is a picture of carrots. One of the things that's very important that I like to do in all of our work in psychology is to really look for the root metaphors. What is the basic analogy that we're applying everything from, drawing everything from? Those of you who have been influenced by Freudian psychology, it's really based on a hydraulic model. That is, we let off steam, we blow up, pressure cooker, and it explodes or not. That was a hydraulic model of emotion. Those of you who are more interested in cognition and cognitive, that really came from the information processing idea of humanist computer, or the brainist computer. So you came to a talk called Ways to Thrive. So I'm going to talk quite a bit about these particular two things, because these are really building blocks of the new model that I'm working towards. I'll say more about finding ways in a moment, but just looking at your definition, thriving, flourishing, hardiness, they're all organic metaphors. They're all symbolic of growth. They're to do with an organism in an environment needing things. So that's a big part of the building blocks, the way we linguistically construct this thing called well-being or thriving. So I'm urging you to go back to the root metaphors of the work you do and really get a sense of what language construction are you making. So we'll talk quite a bit right now about this idea of finding ways. Firstly, finding ways. Way, pathway. Think of the psychological models that use pathway. Those of you who are positive psychologists here, immediately you'll think of hope theory, pathway thoughts, how we generate thoughts to get around obstacles. Those of you who are influenced by Buddhism might think of the Noble Eightfold Path. It's all over the place. These metaphors of our experience based on root metaphors of pathways, routes or routes if you're from the US, journeys, recovery journeys of life. So these ideas to map our experience onto these root metaphors are very important. Resilience recently is becoming an extremely popular concept, set of tools, set of skills. Even that, if you take a developmental model of resilience, bouncing back or bouncing forward on your trajectory, it has also got its metaphor of a journey or a developmental path that we are meant to be on. So firstly, think carefully about the metaphors you are using. Okay, so this is my happy holiday snap, which I promised my sons I would use. So this, of course, is Great Wall of China, and my two sons are here. So I'll show. My youngest son got down. We went up here, down there. My youngest son got to here and wanted to go up there. My eldest son got to here and didn't like it, and we had to go back. But sorry, guys. But what I really, staying with that root metaphor of journey and finding ways, these are the essential building blocks of the model that I'm trying to work towards, bringing in what we already know from wellbeing science. But I'm actually not interested in so much in, we've got PERMA, we've done PERMA survey, that's very good. But they're effectively linear predictors of wellbeing or thriving at one point in time. What I'm interested in is the person, it's a process over time, working on their particular development over time, over their life course, how they improve, don't improve their well-being or their thriving. I'm interested in the process model. I'm interested in the experience of the person over time. So firstly, keeping with us the root metaphor of a journey. But secondly, this idea of over time. One of the most underdone constructs or ideas within well-being or thriving is time. Those of you who are interested in finance, time is paramount. It's not just money, it's money and time interacting. Same with well-being and thriving. Think about time. We're always doing trade-offs between now and the future. Should I have another drink, or what will happen in the morning? Should I do some more work now, or should I? What will that mean? We're constantly trading off immediate pleasure with possible future benefit. It's essential to our experience, and it's an underdone concept in our understandings of well-being. The other one, in terms of, if you look inside a lot of the models of well-being and thriving, there's this thing called people and relationships that constantly comes up. So I'm actually arguing in the model that it's not so much that relationships lead to well-being, it's that positive relationships is well-being. It's fundamentally important. We are social beings, and treating the R in PERMA like it's the same as the P and the E and the M and the A, in my view, is flawed. So I actually give extra status to the relationship component, which is, I understand is contentious, but there you have it. The other thing is this idea of different paths. What I'll talk about is PERMA. For those of you who know what that is yet, they're pathways. And I'll talk about these as different paths. They're not just techniques to do things, they're actual paths over time to achieve thriving. Also in this model, I will talk about two particular well-known concepts, one from motivational psychology and one from sociology. So in this journey, we have approach and avoidance motivation. If that doesn't make sense yet, it will. And secondly, one of the great debates in sociology, structure and agency. How much as an individual can I determine who I am versus how much does society determine it? Big idea, it's been around for a long time. So these are the building blocks of the new thriving model that I'm working on. And finally, it's not that PERMA are the goals. PERMA is the pathway. And it's not that it's all about goal attainment. The actual ultimate destination of the journey is the life well lived. That's the time frame I'm thinking across. I'm thinking across the life span. A lot of these other techniques that we hear about, do this, do that, scratch your head and you'll feel happy, that's all good, but that's one point in time. Very much interested in getting you to stretch out how you think about a lot of the wellbeing science and do it over a longer period of time. So I'm going to unpack all of the building blocks here today with you. So yes, you will go home with some ways to thrive, but it won't be me that tells you what they are. You'll be asked what they are in the context of this particular language. Okay, is that okay? If you don't want that, you can leave, or you can stay and I'll keep going. All right, I'll keep going. So, negativity bias. One of the important concepts, and I'll talk about approach and avoidance. So, I'm not sure, I haven't eaten dinner yet. I'm not sure if you have, but what I want you to do is just to close your eyes and imagine, please, your favourite meal. You really do need to close your eyes to do this. It's important. I'm not going to throw this at you or anything. Think of the best meal, your best meal, your favourite meal. Smell it. Can you see it? Can you smell it? Okay, looking up. Okay, this cockroach here is now in your meal. Sorry, it's supposed to be about thriving. Do you still want your meal? You still want it, even though it's got the cockroach in it? Yep, we got one here. Okay, the question I asked you is there anything, if the cockroach, 1, 2, 3, if several of these have been in and through that meal, is there anything now you can do to that meal to fix it? Yes, no, who can fix it other than get rid of it? Okay, if it wasn't sweet enough, you could add sugar. If it didn't have enough salt, you could add salt. But from Paul Rosen's work, he does work on disgust and what disgusts us. Cockroaches tend to be one of the things. But the simple idea here is the negativity bias. The evidence is that we are, by and large, programmed to pay a lot of attention to negative things, negative events. Some people will argue for survival reasons, but negative things run strong. So in this case, there's nothing we can do to fix the meal because we're so disgusted by the cockroach that it's really hard. Whereas we could add sugar or we could do other things if there were other problems. But some things are so disgusting, and it may be because evolution's built it that way, that it's very pervasive. It's very hard to overcome. And some people will argue this is why negative emotions, fear, anxiety, they often feel more intense than the positive emotions. They may be less frequent, but they feel more intense, whereas joy, contentment, they're more frequent but less intense. So we start getting into those issues around ratios of emotions, etc. But the key message I want you to take away here is negativity bias means that we're more likely to pay attention to negative events. Newspapers deliberately exploit negative events. And so this is the opening for one of the reasons we may need a positive psychology and wellbeing science, is we actually need to work a little harder and use techniques to see the positive, to experience the positive, etc. And this is where I sometimes talk about wellbeing science or the wellbeing movement as emancipatory discourse. It's freeing us from the negativity bias. So I'll talk more about that as we work through. One of the things we're doing at the Centre for Positive Psychology is working on this area of positive systems science. As we talked about, psychologists often work at the individual level, but we need to do more than that and think more about broader systems as well. So yes, well-being of an individual, but what about the well-being of an education system or the well-being of a state or a nation? Changing systems and institutions. Again, that's a problem because what we often see is not only are we as individuals prone to a negativity bias, but I'm seeing it, the more I look, the more I'm finding examples of it in our systems. So we talk about negatively biased systems. Many of us here have been brought up, hung around health systems. One of the things that strikes me about health systems is we have very highly qualified, articulate people who've got elaborate linguistic systems about finding negatives in people. Psychiatry is the area I've worked in, and we train people. I was one of them. I trained for 6 years to be a clinical psychologist, and I get a very elaborate vocabulary about what's wrong with people. And that's okay, I don't regret doing it, but it's a system which perpetuates negative, and it's got a negative focus. And I don't just mean that's a bad thing, I'm stating largely a fact. You don't have to look very far to find it. We'll talk more about that. Legal systems is an interesting one. Erica mentioned I'm on the board of Action for Happiness Australia and Reach Foundation. With the Reach Foundation, we recently changed our legal structure, our entity. To get charity status, by and large, you have to be alleviating distress. You have to be removing a negative, or you can't be a charity. So a lot of our tax law, and that's not technically correct now because of the health promotion laws, but by and large, until recently, you have to be getting rid of a negative to get the tax status of a charity. So our legal structures also have a negativity bias. It's built in. It's hard to avoid this. So these are some of the barriers we'll face when we talk about thriving. And also accounting systems. Is anyone here an accountant? Has anyone here done a budget? Does anyone here wish they had less expenses? Okay. One of the things we'll do, the health economists do it, a lot of accountants do it, we do it in management accounting, cost-benefit analysis. Cost-benefit analysis, we put benefit on the top, we put cost on the bottom. All of our thinking is filtered through cost. So cost is given this special status, seen as a negative thing. Got to reduce it, we can control it, we've got to reduce it. So all of our thinking is channeled through these particular accounting metrics. It's not net benefit analysis where we maximise the net benefit, it's cost-benefit ratio. So you go to a health system, you go to a legal system, you go to an accounting system, and it's really hard to escape the negativity bias. So not only is it in you, it's in the systems that you work in each day. It's in the way your mortgages are structured. It's all around you. So who's feeling good now? Okay, so just wanted to highlight some of that work in terms of negativity bias. So here we have a lovely picture of the Australian flag with the Union Jack on it. No comment. Let's examine your particular negativity biases. That can be, as I say here, they can be insidious, unconscious. They creep up on us. So one of the big public policy questions, should governments prioritise public spending on assisting people who are in great distress, or should we prioritise more on the overall well-being of the population? Who's on, and again, there's no right or wrong here, who thinks we should prioritise alleviating distress from people who are maximise those who have major distress? Who's more promoting the overall well-being of the population, utilitarian type view? Okay. Most people, in the way they operate, the way they think, and the way they vote, are more in line with the first one. And so are a lot of our structures. Okay. Did anyone win? Who won at the Melbourne Cup? Took away a big win. We got a real life one over here. There's about 400 people in this room at the moment. We got one winner over here. What would have more impact on you? Losing $1,000 or winning $1,000? Who would feel more impacted by losing $1,000? Go home and tell your spouse you lost $1,000. Yeah. By and large, the evidence bears that out. People are more concerned by losing the $1,000. If you don't believe me, just go down and have a look at our skyline. Insurance companies are the ones with the big buildings. We put a lot of investment in insuring things. One of the things I hear a lot is, positive psychology, that's really good because we're going to prevent depression and we're going to prevent anxiety or we're going to prevent suicide. They're all very noble and important things to do. But just in doing that, just in the movement of positive psychology being largely for prevention, you are insidiously slipping into the negativity bias because you are defining the outcome of what you're doing in the removal of a negative. And that's good in some instances, but if you're doing it without knowing it, you're actually not fully embracing the positive psychology and wellbeing movement. Nothing wrong with prevention, just be clear about what you are actually doing in your way you're approaching things. Secondly, we hear it a lot, people say they're doing health promotion, and when you actually look at what they're doing illness prevention. Beyond Blue, great organisation, but there's a lot of it is about illness prevention. And that's a good thing, but don't call it health promotion if it's not. This is one, again, negativity bias runs deep. And finally, who here's organisational HR? Anybody? Anybody in the workplace? Okay. So one of the things, workplace wellbeing programs, particularly popular in the US because of the healthcare system. But again, what's the true motivation behind a lot of the workplace wellbeing programs? In many cases, it's to reduce burden of cost, disease cost, etc. So it's, again, come back to a negativity bias. So hopefully just by walking through that, you'll see the many places, the many examples, and how pervasive this negativity bias idea is. It serves a purpose, but just beware and be conscious of it. Okay, so now we come to Chardonnay. Approaching and avoidance. One of the I've talked about negativity bias, but one of the other related sister concepts, if you like, is approach and avoidance motivation. For those of you who hang around me, I'll probably mention this within 24 hours of meeting me. It's a fairly core concept to a lot of the work I do. Who here has heard of approach and avoidance motivation? Many of you may have, some of you won't have. Okay, firstly, fundamentally the idea, I simplify it down. There are more technical definitions, but if you think about approach motivation, you're moving towards something positive. You're motivated to move towards something positive. You're saving for a holiday. You're looking forward to seeing your friend on the weekend, or you're approaching something good. Versus avoidance or escape motivation. Escape, you're running away from a lion. You're running away from a snake. Or avoidance motivation, you're moving away from something you don't want. You're trying to reduce anxiety. You're trying to reduce depression. Don't mistake it meaning you're avoiding someone or avoidance behaviour. Avoidance like in anxiety disorders. It's not meant in exactly the same way. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Give you some more examples. Jonathan Haidt's work. Jonathan Haidt uses the example of making love versus drowning. I'm not going to ask you to put your hand up who here's made love. I'm not going to. But just hypothetically, you would hope that you're attracted to the partner. You want to move towards them. There's a motivation to be together. And if it's good love making, you want it to keep going and savour the journey. So it's not just about the motivation. It's about you actually, if approach motivation tends to have a savouring the journey component to it. Versus drowning. Think about drowning. Not a nice experience. If you're drowning, you want to get to the top or you want to get air. Would that be right? You don't want to walk around looking at the fish, swim around looking at the fish, going, I'm drowning and I'm eventually... You want it over, you want it to escape, gone, finished. There's no journey, you want it finished, like pain. So think about the intensity of that type of motivation. So they're two quite different types of motivations. They're not just opposites. It's not just about flipping a word. They're actually different processes. So bring that with us in thinking about thriving. For some people, this is a little intangible, so I recommend you, rather than talk about avoidance motivation, approach motivation, think about them as goals. Put them as goals. Approach goals. Saving for a holiday. Improving my particular fitness level or something. Avoidance goals, reducing anxiety. Losing weight. Removal of something you don't want. So approaching something you do want, or reducing something or removing something you don't want. Okay, it's a US election day. Really good example of approach and avoidance goals. Were people voting were they voting for Donald Trump? Were they voting against Donald Trump? Were they voting for Hillary Clinton? Were they voting against Hillary Clinton? 4 motivational processes. Approach and avoidance. Depending on which one you think is positive and negative, you map it on. But there are 4 particular ways they could have voted, and you can think about that in terms of approach and avoidance. Was I voting for something I saw as a positive? Was I voting against something I saw as a negative? Etc. So you can actually think about these in multiple ways. They're all around us. These are not esoteric ideas, they're all around us. One of the key ideas I have is that wellbeing theory needs both. We've had parts of psychology which are focused on the negative, removing problems, depression, anxiety, psychopathy, whatever. Lots of things that people usually construe as negative. And then positive psychology has come along amongst other areas and said, what about the positive end? What about, I call it, what about the approach motivation end of it? The important thing is it's not either or. We're not replacing avoidance motivation. We're not replacing the negativity bias. We're augmenting and we're adding. But trying to get this across to our policymakers is a challenge because they're still seeing them in terms of either or. So think in terms of ratios. How many approach goals do you have versus how many avoidance goals you have? And I'll come back to that in a little while. So think and, not or. Approach and avoidance motivation, approach and avoidance goals. And we'll use this to build up our further ways to thriving. Okay, it's time for me to go on holiday again. So this is a Canadian Rockies when I was younger and fitter. So a bit of introductory mountain climbing. You get up at about 4 a.m, you go up with the guide and feel crap all the way because it's so hard. But you are approaching the summit. So the summit's just over here. If a raindrop falls here, it'll either end up in the Pacific, the Atlantic, or up Hudson Bay. So you're up that end of Canada. But yes, I was approaching the top. That was a positive thing. It certainly was when I got there. But all along, to continue our metaphor of the journey, all along, yes, there was an approach goal, but this bit here, if you can't see it, but there's a rope and I'm attached to the guide. If you go down here on the left-hand side, you die because you can't get back. You slide, you fall off. So really good example of approach and avoidance motivation. Yeah, I'm approaching the top, but I'm constantly avoiding the side and I'm travelling on my journey. So I'm just encouraging you to think about these concepts in life all the time because they're all around us. So let's continue on our knowledge of thriving and individual thriving, and then I'll give some examples, and then I'll come back and get you to think about some of the important concepts I've worked with to help build this model of thriving. So we have some well-worn, familiar major theories of well-being in psychology, positive psychology. So this nice picture here was painted from a school friend, painted by a school friend. I would say she was a girlfriend, but my wife's here, so I won't say that. It was painted by a former friend at school. Psychological well-being, one of the core concepts in positive psychology, used to operationalise the eudaimonic well-being that we were talking about. What I like to do, I'm quite a simple person, I like to break things right down to stuff I can remember. So I turned it into grapes. What we mean by that is the building blocks of the psychological wellbeing model from Riff's work and Riff and Key's work. 6 parts. Firstly, personal growth. There's positive relations again, the one I give special status to. Autonomy, having purpose in life. Environmental mastery, that sense of affecting the world, being efficacious, being able to do something in the world, mastering our environment. And that good old self-acceptance, actually thinking I'm okay. Do I accept myself? So these are the 6 subscales of psychological wellbeing from Riff and Key's. It's been around quite a long time. It was originally developed for working with the elderly, but it's fairly well worn, fairly validated. Not as popular at the moment as things like PERMA, but it's been around a long time. So what I'm saying is this is one particular model to think about individual thriving, or to extend our metaphor, these are possible pathways that we can move towards well-being. So that's one model. If you can't remember it, just think grapes and think the acronym and then you remember your pathways. This is the car. Self-determination theory, one of the most cited theories in psychology. Really a needs-based theory, so drawn from Maslow's work. Competency, having a sense of competency, feeling I can do something, again, feeling efficacious. Autonomy, that felt sense of choice. And there's our good old friend that I'm emphasising, relatedness or relationships. Again, notice how it's cutting through many of the major theories. We matter, other people matter, we matter to each other, we are social beings. In many ways, these are not ways to thrive, these are ways to survive psychologically, because this is a needs theory. The idea is if you don't have these three met, you will wither. You will psychologically not flourish. You will wane. So, grapes, car, you can remember those particular things. Now, coming to Psychology Week and PERMA. So, Martin Seligman's Wellbeing theory, which was an elaboration of his earlier work on authentic happiness. So he built it up from basically 3 routes to happiness to 5 routes to happiness, or 5 ways to thrive. Who has been online and done their PERMA report? Okay, if you haven't done that yet, the website URL is on your handout. You can go and get your free validated PERMA report. But I haven't got a picture of a person with a perm, because that's too 1980s, but we remember PERMA. So for those of you who aren't familiar with PERMA, wellbeing theory from Martin Seligman, positive emotions is the P, engagement is the E, R is the relationships or positive relationships, meaning and accomplishment. So the acronym is PERMA. More formally, it gets referred to as wellbeing theory. Martin Seligman says three things about these things. Firstly, they contribute to wellbeing. Secondly, we pursue them for their own end. We don't pursue them because it leads to one of the other ones. We pursue them in and of themselves. And the third thing Marty says is that they're exclusive. They each add something different. So go and do your particular survey online. In the model that I'm presenting tonight, I want you to think of these as ways to thrive, or particular pathways that we can go on our journey. Not necessarily goals in themselves, but pathways over time that we travel. Yes, you can use a particular technique and do it here and now, but I'm more interested in that sustainable change and journey over time where you build these things into your life. And one of the things about them being pathways is if one pathway is blocked, you can always go on a different pathway and still achieve wellbeing or thriving. And that's a really important thing to remember. We don't have to have all of them. The more the better, because then you've got options and you've got other pathways on your journey towards wellbeing. Okay, I looked at my particular score here. Apparently my life's full of meaning, which is a good thing. I showed this to my good colleague, Grace, who's here somewhere. Thank you, Grace. Thank Grace for organising tonight, by the way. I got my score and I walked out and said, oh, wow, I'm almost 2 points higher than the average male my age. And she goes, so are they all becoming short asses? So I was very happy to see my score and I was very happy with Grace's literal interpretation of my comment. But I do encourage you to work with these with your clients, to play with these, because importantly, it's not just the normative scores, it's about the educational value of teaching people the literacy around wellbeing, the literacy and language around this particular area. Yes, very importantly, we can teach mental health first aid and people can learn the signs of depression, anxiety, suicide, very importantly. In addition, they need to learn this language. And this is where this particular work fits. So grapes is one model, the psychological wellbeing model, one way of thinking about pathways. Car, competency, autonomy, relatedness, another way from self-determination. They're pathways. PERMA is another set of pathways, and of course is the feature of Psychology Week and what we're talking about today. Relationships is in all of those three models, which is why I give it particular status. I want to finish with some examples very briefly from different areas, but I want to importantly talk about this idea of agency and structure. So in the work from Michelle McQuaid, Michelle's here somewhere, hello Michelle, wherever you are. Michelle's work has usefully turned PERMA into practical, tangible things that people can do. Practitioners and people love that. One of the challenges though, nurture positive emotions, build engagement, invest in relationships, cultivate meaning, grow accomplishments. So basically doing all of the PERMA-related things. But all of those things, nurture, build, invest, cultivate, grow, they all involve an active, intentional agent. Someone who's motivated, someone who's trying to do something and has the wherewithal to do it. So it assumes agency in sociological terms. It assumes a decision maker, a motivated person to some degree. Our sociologists will ask us, what about the structures of society, such as social norms, inequality? Think about the women's movement, okay? Women can do PERMA, but what about the language, the roles, the social structures, the legal systems, the cultures that may put restraints on them in doing those things? So in my view, if we're going to have a true model of wellbeing or thriving, it must take into account what the sociologists are telling us. Otherwise, we'll all walk out of here as naive individualist psychologists. And this is a big challenge to psychology as a discipline. We need to take this seriously. If you ask me, apart from environmental challenges, what is the biggest threat to wellbeing, I will say it's inequality. Inequality in its many forms. In my view, it's our biggest challenge. It's not that we're not doing gratitude exercises, it's inequality. So the social factors and economic factors impact hugely on wellbeing. So when we work through it, as we work through to build and truly think about thriving, yes, bring your techniques and your bag of tools with you, but think about them over a much broader, longer time frame, and think about them in terms of social structures, social norms, and you as an active agent trying to achieve things, but how are you actually dealing with the social structures, and what are you contributing as well? So this is referred to as the structure and agency debate. The sociologists will argue about this. How much of you is determined by social structures, norms, language, and how much of you is determined by your free will, your intentions? Okay, one version, the individualist, US style, punch the air, we can do anything. Achieve and you believe and you will achieve, full agency model. The other structure, sort of almost a Marxist model, that you're oppressed by language, roles, you actually don't have any individual free will, etc. Two things, and in the debates it really is like a tug of war. If you read the literature, it's been like a tug of war. I don't think it's either or. There are many theorists that don't think it's either or. Part of you is self-defining, part of you is defined by the social structures and things around you. So a complete model of thriving will need to take both of these into account. This is where I used to live before I got brought to Melbourne. It was warm, beautiful, lovely, and I'm really happy to be here and share with you tonight. But it doesn't have to be a tug of war. In the same way it's approach and avoidance, it's agency and structure, or self-defined and society-defined. Complete models of wellbeing will need to take this into account. We cannot ignore systems and structures, or if we do, in my view, we'll have incomplete models. I want to come back to that, but I want to give you a couple of examples from systems. If we're thinking about systems and structures, not only are we thinking at the individual level, but we need to think more broadly. I mentioned in the centre we're working on positive systems science. We're trying to marry systems theory with positive psychology. So thinking more broadly of how do we think about actual positive systems, not just positive individuals. So these are some steps towards that. So thriving in health systems, so starting with mental health. In some of my former work, I've done a lot of work with mental health systems, mental health recovery. The idea of recovery in this context is recovery defined by the person. So a person, for example, living with schizophrenia, how do they define a positive outcome? Not how does the profession, medical profession, psychological profession define it, how do they define it? In this particular work, staying with our metaphor of a journey, it's really the idea of a recovery journey, very pervasive in this this particular work. What we did, which is documented in a former book called Psychological Recovery, is we looked at all the published narratives of people who had lived with schizophrenia and tracked their journey of recovery in their words. And we did effectively a narrative analysis to look at the themes that were coming from their narratives. And interestingly, hope, meaning, sense of identity or self-acceptance, idea of personal responsibility or agency, and the idea of personal growth. These were the themes that are coming from people who have lived and continue to live with schizophrenia. Not mentioning symptoms that much, not mentioning rehabilitation as such, mentioning constructs largely which positive psychologists deal with. So on the one hand, we have fairly disenfranchised group of people and their lived experience of a major difficult illness, and then we have the privileged positive psychology scientists dealing with the same things, unbeknownst, coming together. So one of the challenges is, what does this mean at a systems level? One of the things we've done is we've developed a model called the collaborative recovery model, which we've now licensed as being used in every mainland state of Australia. We're in Melbourne. Eastern Health are rolling this out across their mental health system. And what it effectively is, it's a coaching model using the core concepts of positive psychology and wellbeing, emphasising approach motivation. So the recovery movement is now mainstream policy in most English-speaking nations. So we have whole public mental health systems which are trying to adjust the way they're actually working with this. Consistent with the idea of life journey, within this model we have developed tools called the camera, the compass and the map. So there's your metaphor of a journey, identifying strengths, setting goals within line with values, and then monitoring. There's nothing magic about that at the individual level, and many practitioners would already be doing this. But how do we get that approach, motivation idea into, gone too far, into the system? Another study we did, we looked at case management goals of people with schizophrenia across Australia. I think it was about 180 people, which is a reasonably good sample for people with schizophrenia. And we tracked over time their approach and avoidance goals as they progressed through recovery. And what you'll notice here is as they progress through their recovery defined by them, not just symptom reduction, their notion of recovery as measured by a tool we developed. As they progress through their recovery, they set more approach goals and relatively less avoidance goals. So here we have a dynamic way of tracking a journey of very disenfranchised people using concepts which are centrepiece to positive psychology. So people who tell me that positive psychology is only for the happy end of town or not people with significant disadvantage, I would say, sorry, you're wrong. And I've done that for the last 10 years because of the work we've been doing in that area. So it's just one example of how to get a whole system to think in terms of approach goals when they've been fully trained with a language to think in terms of avoidance goals. Medication means medicate, assumed goal, reduce, get rid of. So that's one example. This book, I literally sent off the last editing of it this morning. My colleague, Mike Slade from the UK, and also Aaron Jardine, some of you will know from New Zealand. You will be invited to the launch. What we're effectively doing is taking the mental health recovery work and marrying it to the wellbeing science literature to see what happens. And there's 25 world leaders in that area in that book. So I look forward to seeing you at the launch. We will send you more information about that as we work through. A second example of the other book that Erica kindly mentioned, I'm not going to talk a lot about this, but other than to say, Psychology of Positivity and Strengths at Work. Who went to work today? Who felt they were thriving all day? Okay. Just some examples of what's in this. It's really thinking about wellbeing and thriving at the individual level, but also at the organisational level, and some examples for whole sectors. So you'll see some examples there: flow at work, humility at work. Also some organisational ideas, positive org change, but particularly some new areas of positive psychology in agriculture. What's happening for farmers? What's happening for people who are doing arts and craft? That's a huge industry around the world. What's happening in the wellbeing space for that group of people? So again, you'll be invited to that launch as well. So more red wine, white wine, hedonic pleasure, all of that. So stay tuned for that. It is coming. One other thing I'd like to mention, coming to the the education sector. We've seen this in the media. We're hearing a lot about GLBTI in the schools. We're hearing about respectful relationships. We are involved, Helen Cahill, myself, Peggy Kern and Richard Midford. University of Melbourne's collaborating with the Department of Education and Vic Health to evaluate part of the rollout of the Resilience, Rights and Respectful Relationships project in Victorian schools, and how are we doing this at scale. So we're looking at the implementation of the social emotional learning part, which is really the resilience bit. Alongside that, there is the rights part, gender-based violence, prevention of gender-based violence, prevention of bullying for people with GLBTI. You would have seen that in the media. So these are some examples of work that's being done in this area as part of the broader area of positive education, which we're doing at the Centre for Positive Psychology. So just touching on some examples, which has really tracked my career from mental health systems into the workplace and now into education. Thinking systemically, thinking more broadly about these. I mentioned positive education briefly. One of the things that worries me is, as psychologists, we go in and we do interventions. But what I'm interested in is, what are people actually learning in the school interventions? So we're developing this idea of wellbeing literacy. So what's the vocabulary of wellbeing? What's the knowledge? What's the skills that we are teaching and learning so that we can intentionally maintain or improve wellbeing of self and, importantly, wellbeing of others? So it's not the same as mental health literacy, which we're talking about wellbeing broadly. So as a quick example, what do you know about wellbeing? If you had to write down everything you knew about wellbeing, what would you write down? And if you had to think about students, say year 10 students, what should they actually know? And likewise, the same questions, what vocabulary do you use? And what vocabulary should students use? If we had NAPLAN with wellbeing literacy in it. If we had a national test of wellbeing literacy, regardless if you like NAPLAN or not, what would you put in there? That is the question. And similarly with skills. And importantly, wellbeing literacy doesn't just belong in schools. You could easily replace the word student with parent. What are you teaching your child? Teacher, employee, patient. Wellbeing literacy, it's a population health concept, which is part of the generational systemic change which we're truly aiming for. If we're going to go beyond the negativity bias and only focus on the negative end of town. Yes, we need to prevent illness, but also we need to build the literacy around intentional wellbeing as much as we can. On that note, you've been very patient. I'm going to leave you with one last thing which will take us back to where we started on our journey. I've told you that we're building a model of wellbeing and thriving which involves journey over time, paying particular attention to the pathways. Today we'll use PERMA as our pathways, taking into account balancing approach and avoidance, and taking into account social structures, with the destination is not just achieving a goal, it's building a life which is well lived. So on your handout, the second part of your handout, I've left you with some questions, which are basically approach and avoidance meets agency and structure. That is approach motivation and avoidance motivation, and also structure, agency versus how much society impacts on me. So have a think, how can I pick one of PERMA, how can I improve that? That's you as an individual approaching something positive. How can I reduce something negative? So it might be removing anxiety, removing something bad in your life that you don't want. Then it gets interesting when we say, how can we help people be free to experience the positive? Freedom to, based on Isaac Berlin's positive liberty. How can I help people be free to achieve this? And notice it's not just you, it's people. And how can we help people be free from, which is Isaac Berlin's negative liberty. Being free from a restraint is different than being free to do something. For those of you who are lawyers, have a look at that. They're actually different things. So have a think about those things. You'll probably struggle with 3 and 4, and that's the whole point. We're trying to get you to think more systemically, more in terms of sociological restraints upon you on your journey to thriving. So in sum, what I've taken you through. Firstly, what is thriving? Had a look at negativity bias and how pervasive it is for you and for systems. Approach and avoidance. I told you about grapes. I told you about car. I told you about PERMA. And I encourage you to complete your PERMA survey. We looked at some examples in the health system, particularly approach and avoidance goals. Some examples, or at least a book in the workplace. And then I spoke with you about some local initiatives in the education system. Encourage you to think more about wellbeing literacy. So how do we have a whole generation and a whole population literate in wellbeing, not just mental illness? And then I challenge you and encourage you to think about agency and structure on your wellbeing pathways. And on that note, I'll thank you very much for coming this evening, and I wish you very well.